Today, I'd like to introduce Dr. Chris Stride, who's going to talk to us about sporting statues. Chris is an applied statistician based at the University of Sheffield. He's primarily a statistics consultant and, he says, peripatetic statistics trainer, working mainly in psychology, business, and the other social sciences. But he also has this secret double life as a sports historian, and we're delighted that he's been able to join us today. Chris's sports history research is focused on material, culture, heritage, and nostalgia, most notably in the form of monuments of sports people under the guise of sports statues. And later on, we'll give you the website address, or he will give you the website address that you can access all the work that they've been doing on the project. As usual, Chris is happy to answer questions at the end of his talk. The procedure, as Sally said, is to use the Q&A button at the bottom right of the screen. You type in the questions and I put the questions to Chris. So Chris, after that brief introduction, over to you.
Oh, thanks very much, Tim. Okay, right. So I'm going to talk today about sports statues. I'm going to talk about them in the context of the UK and the different statues that we have here across all manner of different sports, as you'll see. But first, a little bit about the project itself. So is my thing going to go forward? There we go. So why am I researching sports statues? Well, when I started off doing it as a statistician, someone asked me, have you seen these football statues around the UK? And I said, oh, I've seen a few. And that sort of piqued my interest. And I was interested as a statistician how many there actually were. But very soon I found out that actually the interesting thing about these was not the number of them or even the distribution of them. It's the stories behind them. As a researcher called Kirk Savage from the US said, the monuments erected by people actually reveal who the people are. It's not so much who's being depicted, but it's the monuments tell us about the people who put them up. Now, the project's been going on for about 10 years now. You can go to our website and you'll see statue databases for UK sport, US baseball, world cricket, world football. And alongside that, there's various pieces of academic research. There's about 10 papers, a few book chapters, a few more generalist articles for sports magazines. And anybody's welcome to go onto our website and download that, or just browse the databases. I think we get about 40 or 50,000 visitors a year, and I would guess most of them just browse around and go, oh, look at that funny statue of so-and-so. But there's more material there if you want to read. Now, I'm going to talk today about the UK sports statuary. So as a starter, there's a little map showing where they all are. 229 subject-specific statues or statue groups, and a further 50 statues with anonymous subjects. So just a statue of someone kicking a ball or running or throwing a javelin or something like that. Of these, across the subject-specific statues, there's 216 different athletes depicted. And it's very much a recent thing, 95% of these statues have been erected since 1990. Though it's worth noting in the UK, we also have a Discobolus, which I think pretty much our country stole from Greece. And that's several years BC. So there is a very old one in the UK, but the majority of these, it's very much a modern phenomenon. Different location types. Where can you find these? Well, you're most likely to find one outside a sports stadium, particularly a football stadium. There's a couple at our national stadium at Wembley as well. There's a few at training grounds, but as well as stadiums, the next most popular site tends to be the city of birth of the subject. There's a few in museums, halls of fames and graveyards and commercial sites as well. But yeah, stadiums and city centres are where you'll tend to find them. There are different designs. I think we classify them into 4 basic designs: action, triumph, posed, and then a 4th category, which there's a few of, interacting with fans. It's not quite the same as sporting action, but the subject waving or interacting somehow with supporters. So action, obviously showing the subject in athletic action. There's Tony Brown of West Bromwich Albion Football Club kicking a ball. Triumph, there's Frankie Dettori celebrating, I think, his 7th winner at Ascot when he won all 7 races one afternoon. Posed, there's Nick Faldo leaning on a golf club there and interacting with fans. That's Chris Turner, who's manager of Peterborough United Football Club. And the designs often incorporate personal or family memories when sculptors come to sculpt their subject. Then sometimes they work from largely their imagination, but often they'll be working from a photo or a number of photos that the commissioning or the commissioners of the statue feel the sort of design they'd like to see. And those ideas will be shared with the family of the subject. As I said, the photos of subjects are often used as a primary basis for designs, particularly if the subject passed on many years or played many years before. These sort of what we call flashbulb memory designs. And I think that's led some people to question whether is this really art or is it just copying, which is another discussion I'm happy to take up at the end. What about the subjects of these statues? Well, the majority are of actual athletes from different sports, but there are managers and coaches in there. So there's Sir Alex Ferguson there outside Aberdeen Stadium. The guy on the right there is Adrian Newey. He worked in Grand Prix racing as a designer and I think team manager at some point as well. I think he worked for McLaren. I could be, my Grand Prix knowledge isn't 100%, so I'm willing to be corrected on that. But you can also have statues of chairmen or founders. On the left there, you've got Ludwig Gutmann, who was effectively the founder of the Paralympic movement, certainly heavily involved in it. That's his statue at Stoke Mandeville Hospital, where injured service people were treated after the Second World War. Second guy on the right there, that's William McGregor, founded the Football League in the UK. And there's even statues of fans. Guy on the right, a Rochdale FC fan called David Clough, who dedicated his whole life to fundraising for the club. And when he died, they put a statue of him in the main stand in his favourite seat. And you can have statues of teams or multi-subject. We haven't got any really great team statues in the UK. If you go abroad, I've seen some great football statues and even baseball statues showing team groups. In the UK, haven't got anything quite like that, but there are some multi-subject statues. On the left, the champion statue, which is West Ham United players who were in England's World Cup winning team. Top middle there, that's called the Rugby League statue. It's at Wembley and it shows rugby league players through the ages. Bottom right, a rowing team, I guess. Gold medal winners for Great Britain in the Olympics, Steve Redgrave and Matthew Pinsent. How do these projects come about? Well, any project has to have someone who suggests it or starts it. And the project's got to be funded in some way as well. So there are different sources of these things. The majority of football statues, at least, tend to be funded by football clubs and instigated by clubs. But local authorities, particularly where a statue ends up in the town centre, are often the people who suggest a project. Fans as well, whether they're fans of a club or in some cases fans of individual athletes. The local media often sense a good potential story. Let's say a local athlete has won a medal in the Olympics. The local media will often have a story running fairly quickly after that. Will there be a statue of this person in the town? And that can start a campaign going. Sculptors themselves sometimes have thought, I'd like to do a statue of this particular person. Sculpting the human form has always been a test of a sculptor's art, and athletes in particular present particular challenges. So some projects are started by sculptors, and then the sculpture attempted to be sold on afterwards. Then the sports authorities. This is less common, but for national statues at least, like the Bobby Moore statue at Wembley or the Rugby League statue at Wembley, then it's the national sports bodies who will probably take the lead. But all these different people might be statue instigators and funders. But what normally happens with any statue project is that a committee is formed containing all these disparate sources, and the subject's family as well will most likely be added to that committee, just so the public is reassured that the family are reassured they've got an input into what the depiction of their loved one is going to look like at the end. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, the majority of this talk, is just take you around the UK in 7 different sports statues. And I've picked these just to illustrate different issues, different characteristics, different reasons, different typologies of sports statues within the UK, and different questions that are raised when we see them. So those 7 different topics I'm going to talk about are team sports, local legends, in memoriam, national heroes, history or memory, diversity, and finally multivalence and interactivity, and go through those in sequence. So we'll start off with team sport, and I'm going to pick up one statue to represent each. So the first one where we're going to start, that's the statue of Stanley Matthews in Stoke-on-Trent. It's at Stoke City FC's ground, the Britannia Stadium. It's a relatively recent stadium, built in the late 1990s. This is a very typical statue in some ways. Team sports account for 60% of UK sports statues. Football itself has 44% of all UK sports statues. So football, dominant sport, hegemonic sport in the UK, and that's reflected in the statuary. And the majority of the football statues in the UK are found at stadiums. Certainly not all of them, the majority are at stadiums. Why? Why is team sport dominant? Well, team sports, particularly football, but also rugby and cricket to some degree, have the advantage of having both a funded club playing regular fixtures and a fan base with organisational capabilities and fundraising capabilities. So let's try and pick a popular British athlete, for instance. I'll pick one from Sheffield because that's where I'm from. Jessica Ennis-Hill, gold medal winner in the 2012 Olympics. You don't really get Jessica Ennis fans in the same way you have Manchester United fans or Sheffield Wednesday fans or whatever. Football clubs have active, large fan bases. Football clubs have large budgets. That makes sorting out a statue project much easier for them. They also have land to put the statue on. So for statues of non-team sports, of individuals, again, I go back to the example of, say, Jessica Ennis-Hill, where would you put it? There's no such question for a football club. They have their land. They're building this statue to go on their land. They also have multiple motivations to erect a statue, which are to do with publicising the club, branding the club, creating identity. The statue is good PR, essentially. It can engage supporters. It can create identity in what can be quite a bland stadium environment if they have a modern stadium. Particularly, the idea of branding or marketing through nostalgia is an important reason why these statues have been built. Putting up a statue of a player, particularly a player of, say, 20, 30, 40 years previous, inspires nostalgia in supporters for maybe a mythical golden era, maybe it could be a true golden era. It inspires nostalgia for a time when players were more located, more loyal heroes. These days, footballers transfer clubs very regularly. The game is more globalized, but 30, 40, 50 years ago, the game was more of a local thing. And a lot of fans miss that. They prefer that idea of the local club. It also inspires nostalgia in fans to their childhood. They saw this player when they were younger. This was their hero of their teenage years. And seeing him back at the stadium is something that makes them feel bonded to the club. Ultimately, evoking nostalgia in fans has been shown to increase their attachment to the club. So it's good business for the club to inspire that nostalgia. Putting a statue up is a very easy way of achieving that. A statue of an old player also promotes the authenticity of the club. A statue itself, a deeply traditional art form, figurative statue in bronze, realist design. It's saying this is an authentic club. We've had players who've played for us for many years. We've had heroes. We have a history, and that's attractive both to existing local fans. It's also attractive to new and overseas fans who like to see they're buying into something with a history. When a statue of a great player is put up as well, in some cases, clubs could be said to be what's called burging, basking in reflected glory. If a club has had a great England international, maybe one who helped win the World Cup, then putting a statue of that player up is linking their club to that success. We've developed this great player. He's gone on and served the country. Likewise, statues of glorious moments. There are plenty of statues out there that show a manager or a player lifting a trophy. Putting that outside your stadium is saying, we're a great club. We've won trophies. Finally, a lot of modern football stadiums have been constructed in the last 20, 30 years. And even those that haven't have been substantially redeveloped. And they can look rather bland, rather like a warehouse or a large shopping centre from the outside. Whereas old stadiums had a diversity of landscape, a complex landscape that proved attractive to many supporters, the little nooks and crannies of the stadiums they knew well, the history that was built up over the years as the stadium developed. Modern stadiums don't have that. They're a blank canvas in a lot of cases. And introducing a statue brings specific visual identity, and it transfers that history of the old ground to the new ground. Now, many of these motivations and meanings behind stadium statues transfer to statues that are in a civic setting. So we'll move to look at a civic statue now. And we're going to go to the statue a little bit to the southeast of where we were. We're going to look at the statue of Harold Larwood in Kirkby and Ashfield in Nottinghamshire. So Harold Larwood's a great cricketer, played for England, most famous for playing in the Bodyline series of 1933, for those who know their cricket, when England won in Australia, but spent a lot of the time bowling the ball at the batsman's head. Harold Larwood was our fastest bowler, so he did a lot of that bowling at batsmen's heads. But a really, really great bowler, one of England's greatest fast bowlers historically. And he grew up in Kirkby and Ashfield, worked down the local mine. That was where the employment was in those days. And he was one of a number of cricketers of that era who escaped the mine and became fast bowling heroes. Now, Kirkby and Ashfield, the mines have gone now. And there's not, or at least when the mines went, there weren't a lot of other jobs or other ways for the town to have an identity. That when the mines shut, the town was stripped of its identity in a sense. And you'll find that sports statues in civic locations like Harold Larwood here tend to be in locations, small or medium-sized towns or new towns that don't have or have lost their identity in some way. Introducing a statue to the town brings back some of that. We're no longer Kirkby and Ashfield famous for its mining heritage. We're Kirkby and Ashfield famous for producing this great sportsman. So as I said, you will find a lot of these sorts of statues in small or medium-sized towns, former industrial towns, where that original meaning, the reason for the place being there has gone, and they have to try and reinvent themselves somehow. In other cases, towns are trying to reinforce an identity that's already based on a particular sport. So on the left there, that's a statue of a surfer in Newquay in Cornwall. Now, Newquay is the UK's centre of surfing, and that's proclaiming we are the centre of surfing. One on the right, that's a statue of people playing rugby in Rugby. Rugby likes to style itself as the birthplace of rugby union. That's dubious historically, I believe, but after all, the name of the place is Rugby. Why wouldn't they celebrate that with some statues of rugby players? Within towns or cities, redeveloped city centres are obvious popular sites for statues, not only because many town centres look the same these days, has the same chain shops in them, and so a statue can bring that local identity back in, but also because when town centre redevelopments take place, the developers in some areas have to give a percentage for art to the council. That is, they have to make a small donation to be spent on some sort of public art, and then the council gets to spend that. So here, this statue here, it's called the Spirit of Cricket. It's in Hastings. A new shopping centre was built on the old cricket ground, so someone playing cricket was an obvious choice. Very sad. It was a beautiful old cricket ground right in the centre of town, but they built over it, and now there's just a bronze cricketer there. Now, you might be saying, well, okay, they have to put a statue there. They've got a percentage for art, but why a sports person? Why have sports people gone in there? Well, it's partly to do with traditions around sculpture, and it's partly to do with changes in the sorts of people that the public perhaps admire and respect. So as well as that funding from developers, a lot of funding for public art these days comes from the National Lottery. If funding's coming from the National Lottery, which is basically public donations, then the public's taste in art has to be taken into account more than, say, if it was a private donor. Research has shown that the public likes figurative statues. They prefer figurative art to more abstract art. Okay. So we've got to do a figurative statue. The money's there, either from developers or from the lottery. We're going to put a statue up in a town centre, and it's going to be a figurative statue. So who are we going to choose? Well, in the past, and as you'll see, if you look around city centres in the UK, there's lots and lots of statues from the Victorian times, when they tended to put up religious leaders or political leaders or military leaders or royals. But these days, religious and political leaders would be seen as a very odd choice. They're not so popular with the public. Even military or royal subjects can be divisive. I don't think we're going to see any Prince Harry statues in the city centres very soon. So local sporting heroes have taken over as the default choice. They're fairly uncontroversial in most cases. So it's something the public can get behind. The council won't get any criticism about it. They're recognisable figures. And they're non-controversial, like I said. They're an easy choice. Okay, we're going to move now into our third statue to look at. This one's in Northern Ireland. And this statue, or this group of statues, reflects another aspect of sports statues. That's the idea of in memoriam, commemorating a tragic death. So we're going there. I've done it the wrong way around, haven't I? My animation hasn't quite worked there. Apologies. But this is the statue of Joey Dunlop in Ballymoney in Northern Ireland. So Joey Dunlop, motorcycle racer, and died in a race about 20 years ago now. And the statue was put up with him in his hometown of Ballymoney. Since then, his brother, Robert Dunlop, has died, and there's a statue of him in the same area. And then Robert's son also died in a crash in a race, and there's a statue of him there as well. So it's like a little memorial garden there. Now, these sort of statues, I think, have a very different meaning. This isn't about nostalgia for Joey Dunlop. It's not about Ballymoney trying to boast about itself as having a specific identity with motorcycle racing, even though it has to some extent. This is about commemorating Joey Dunlop, a favourite son of the town who died young. He also did a lot of charitable works as well. So very highly respected in the town. Now, you'll find that in terms of individual sports with the most statues, they tend to be the danger sports, motor racing and boxing particularly. Reasons for that? Well, many of these statues commemorate athletes who died in competition and or at a young age. And also, as well as there being a clear reason for those statues, someone dying tragically tends to evoke public sympathy and awareness, tends to, the danger sports also have strong communities of competitors and fans. Motorcycling in the UK is very much a cult sport. If someone's into motorcycling, they tend to be really into it. Likewise, boxing, there's a very strong community around boxing, not always visible to the wider public, but ex-boxers associations exist and are very well supported by those people who are involved in the sport. People tend to stay involved in the sport after giving up. And with those structures, it makes it much easier to organise and fund memorialisation. I think these sort of statues, the meaning, as I said, is very different from statues where the subject was alive when the statue was unveiled or died when they were much older. There's a poignancy to these statues that isn't there with statues of, say, a footballer who's just retired or is still playing. You could almost think of these statues of competitors from danger sports who died as secular grave sites, an alternative grave to the one in the churchyard. And that links into the idea of sport as a religion. So these sports such as boxing or motor racing, where the awareness of life and death is probably a lot stronger, it's linked far more into the sport, then these statues act as pilgrimage sites, I suppose. I think there's another aspect as well to them, though. If you look back, there's relatively few sports statues of competitors who died. Very few sports statues generally anyway before the 1990s. There's one or two of competitors who died in crashes, motor racing crashes, but very few. It's much more common these days. And I do wonder if this is a sort of mourning inflation, in the same way that statues of footballers outside stadiums where an old player has died, rather than a round of applause these days. They now put a statue of him up outside the stadium. Motor racing, driver or motorcyclist dies in a crash. Rather than just his grave, they now put a statue up. And the awareness of mourning and the desire for more public mourning is something I think has increased certainly since the late 80s, early 90s. People often point at the death of Princess Diana as a marking point there, when public shows of grief became a more acceptable thing in the UK. Okay, let's move on. Across. Oh, my arrow's gone wrong there as well. I don't know why that's happened. Ah, no, this actually isn't a problem. This isn't incorrect. This is supposed to look like this, because we're now moving on to some differently placed statues. Lester Piggott. So the reason there's lots of arrows there is because Lester Piggott's got lots of statues. And what I'm going to talk about now is national sports statues. Now, these are much rarer. There's a reason for that, with multiple reasons for that, really. Firstly, they need some sort of national consensus, or at least in many cases they do. For someone to be a national sports hero rather than a local sports hero, they've got to have been really, really, really good. And obviously there's a limited number of people who are really, 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 really good. So there's fewer possible subjects. And there's got to be a national consensus about their greatness, I think. And then there's got to be some sort of funding as well. And actual national sports bodies often have less motivation than clubs or cities to put a statue up. There needs to be a place to put them as well. Not all sports have national stadiums. So where are you going to put the statue? And Lester Piggott statues are quite unusual because they're instigated by a journalist, and there isn't one location. There isn't a national stadium for sports, for horse racing in the UK. So rather than doing one statue, they did several statues and put them around at major racecourses. The other national statues in the UK, such as Bobby Moore at Wembley or the Rugby League heroes at Wembley, they're at a significant stadium for those sports. But Lester Piggott, said horse racing hasn't got that single place. So we've got multiple Lester Pigotts, and there's one at York, Epsom, Newmarket, Ascot, and then there's one at the museum as well. So what makes national statues different, apart from those things? I think in terms of the way people view them, there isn't that same sense of club loyalty as you would get with, say, a football statue. People are looking at this figure as perhaps transcending time for it's not nostalgia for a particular era as such. A national sporting hero has to be someone whose achievements so great that they're across all eras. And these are statues that I think will stand the test of time, perhaps longer than some of the club-related statues that exist. Okay, so move on again. We're going to move up now to Edinburgh. Move up from Lester Piggott up to a single statue in Edinburgh. And what I'm going to talk about now is history or memory. So one criticism of sports statues, and a completely valid one, is what are they? Do they reflect sport history, or do they reflect fan memory? And in many cases, I think they reflect memory. The reason I say that is if you look at the athletes who are chosen to be subjects, then the vast majority of them tend to be people who are celebrated, say, 20 or 30 years after their career. And that's because so many of them, particularly the football ones, but also some of the other sports people depicted in city centres, they've been chosen to evoke nostalgia. So it's very nice when you find one that isn't of that type. And here's a really good example. This is John Rattray. He was a golfer from the 1700s. The winner of the first ever golf competition and involved in the early rules of golf as well. Amazing backstory to his life. He was the physician to Bonnie Prince Charlie as well. And I think it was his golfing connections that basically meant he didn't get executed after the Battle of Culloden. He got away with it. How does John Rattray end up with a statue? Well, if John Rattray was a footballer from the early years of football, he'd be much less likely to get a statue, I think, because football statues tend to be picked by clubs who are trying to evoke nostalgia, or fans who want to select someone they've seen in action. It tends to be where public authorities are involved, or maybe a sculptor's involved, or a historian leads a project, that you get subjects from further back in history. This bias in subject choice against figures from the distant past basically means that great performers from the pre-war era are far less likely to be sculpted. And the longer time goes on, the less likely they are, because the further out away from living memory they are. And I think that's sad, really. Founders of sports and other key early figures that have made the sport what it is today are far less likely to be depicted, because a lot of our popular sports were founded back Victorian era, some of them horse racing, golf, a bit before then. And the people who were responsible for that game today are largely forgotten. And they're people who the history aspect of a statue, bringing that history to the public, would be a really great thing and be overdue recognition. But the motivations behind many statues means that they were unlikely ever to be depicted. Likewise, if we're thinking about the idea of history or memory in statues, the images that are sculpted often are designed to preserve and pass on specific memories. We can think of a sports statue as edited highlights, not a definitive history. In fact, in some cases, the image sculpted may not be historical fact. I think of the William Webb Ellis statue in rugby, where William Webb Ellis is painted as the founder of rugby union. Of course, that's a myth rather than the truth. But there's a statue of him in rugby running with a rugby ball. Okay. Go down now to the Midlands, and I'm going to talk about diversity in statues. And the statue I'm talking about here is Dorothy Round. That's the one on the left. Wimbledon women's champion in the 1930s. She's one of just 3 UK statues of female athletes. We've got 216 different subjects depicted in the UK. By sports statues, only 3 are women. But I'm going to argue this isn't a bias against female athletes at the point of commissioning the statue. That's not the case. Instead, it's reflecting a combination of the type of sports that commission most statues, that's team sports, particularly football. The reasons that drive those subject choices, that is attempting to evoke nostalgia in fans, the idea of memory, not history. And the historical bias against female participation in those sports. The discrimination isn't at the point of choosing the statue subject. It's simply reflecting discrimination that happened in the past and the era that people tend to choose statue subjects from. So as I commented before, pioneers don't tend to be honoured very often. It tends to be that loyal player from 20, 30 years ago who scored a lot of goals. Now, many natural statue subjects are either pioneers from an unremembered distant past, or in the terms of women's sport, many of our pioneers are very recent. There's a similar thing you could have said a few years ago about ethnic representation in sports statues. About 10, 15 years ago, there weren't any football statues of black players. They were completely ignored. But really, the emergence of a large number of black players in English football happened in the late 1970s, early 80s. And once we got to 20 or 30 years since then, we started to see statues of them because there's that nostalgia element coming in as well. It's not just that. There's been a very clear awareness of lack of diversity, and that is prompted statue projects, both at football clubs and civic statues, to attempt to address this. So the statue on that previous slide, that's known as the celebration statue, 3 black players who played for West Brom, Cyril Regis, Brendan Batson, Laurie Cunningham. Famous statue of them that was unveiled a few years ago now in West Bromwich. And those 3 players really was West Bromwich were the first club to have a group of black players coming through, late 70s, early 80s. And that honours their influence. And also, you could see it as an attempt at reparations for the racism that they had to suffer, bananas thrown at them, monkey chants, etc., that they had to endure in the late 70s. So some of these statues can be viewed perhaps as reparations. But I think, maybe I'm being over cynical here, but I think there's also an issue with some of the statues of black players we're seeing now. There's an element of corporate branding around this. Good PR, put a statue up of a black footballer. It shows that we are politically correct. And I think there's also an element, certainly in perhaps the West Bromwich one, it's gone West Bromwich Town Centre. If you look at the plaque, it's very much saying West Bromwich. West Bromwich was a place where we were racially tolerant when other places weren't. You see this in particularly in the US with baseball statues of Negro League players from the 1930s, where the statue plaques don't always acknowledge the greatness of the player. It's more about we at the time, all the other towns were racist, but look at us. We were decent people before other places were. Statue depicted there, by the way, that's of Arthur Wharton, St. George's Park in Staffs, and that's the FA headquarters. So that's the FA's attempt to say, look, we're acknowledging the first black professional player. That's who Arthur Wharton was. Now, the Scottish FA were thinking of putting a statue of Andrew Watson, who was the first black international footballer, putting that at Hampden Park, head of the headquarters of football in Scotland. And that project seems to have stalled because it was found out that Andrew Watson was both he was both a black footballer in the Victorian era, but he had connections to slave traders as well, and that made it a little bit more awkward to promote him. So I'm not aware that we're sure where that one's going to go, but it shows some of the issues that can come up in these situations. Okay, last statue. So going down to London now, it's Thierry Henry. So I'll flick forward and then back. There's the Thierry Henry statue at Arsenal, very famous. First statue of an overseas footballer in the UK, first statue of a black footballer in the UK. But I'm going to talk about this one because I think it's a great example of how statues can hold multiple meanings. So people themselves can see different things in a statue. Different people can see different things in statues, and people's view of statues can change across time as well. Now, that holding of different meanings is called multivalence, and it's that multivalence, I think, that makes statues a really good branding tool. Clubs can use them, or cities can use them, and they mean different positive things to different people. They tick multiple boxes. But they can also be potentially awkward because multiple groups of people can have a claim on that image and the subject's legacy. So let's think about Thierry Henry. What does this statue mean to different people? Well, to foreign tourists who are visiting Arsenal Stadium near the middle of London, they'll see Thierry Henry and go, Thierry Henry, he used to play for Arsenal. What a great club Arsenal are. It becomes a site of sports tourism, effectively. People doing the stadium tour have their photo next to the Thierry Henry statue. And this is a good example of how some sports statues are gradually being made more interactive. If you have a low or no plinth at all, people can touch the statue, have their photo by it. It becomes more attractive. But it's also a site of conflict and rivalry. Arsenal hate Spurs, Spurs hate Arsenal. Now that statue of Thierry Henry is a goal celebration after he scored against Spurs. So the presence of that statue with that design is taunting Spurs fans who come or go past Arsenal Stadium. Here's Thierry Henry celebrating a goal against you lot. But equally, Spurs fans might sneak a cheeky shirt or scarf on Henry and take a photo. And that's their revenge. Look at Thierry Henry in a Spurs shirt. Ha ha ha. Statues can become sites of protest. They can be sites of protest against club owners because, as I said, different people feel they have ownership of the statue. Arsenal paid for that statue, but Thierry Henry, the fans think Thierry Henry is one of them. He's one of their heroes. So in that sense, his statue is theirs. It's part of their tradition, their history. And so when they wanted to get one of the Arsenal directors to resign, Stan Kroenke, the Thierry Henry statue is where they were protesting. You can see the Kroenke out banner or bit of paper there on the Henry statue. Other people can use statues, people not even connected to the clubs. You can see Henry in a mask there. That was a statue against air pollution. And they linked that into football. I'm not quite sure how they made that link, but a lot of air pollution in London around that area. And they're saying we wouldn't want Thierry to choke to death. So they put a little mask on him with footballs. It makes a good image. Statues can be sites of meeting and collective celebration. This is a different statue here, the champion statue in West Ham, and there's West Ham fans celebrating. They're all crowded around the statue. Again, access to that statue increases the interactivity. There can be sites of belonging. So for fans contributing to the statue project, that brings its own sense of belonging. This statue is the statue of Sam Bartram in Charlton, at Charlton Athletic FC. And I remember a quote from the Charlton marketing manager when I interviewed him about this. He said, this little lad came and donated 50p to the statue fund. And he said it, and said at the time, Sam, he hadn't seen Sam Bartram play. Sam Bartram played 60, 70 years before this lad was born. But the lad said, I wanted to give 50p to the project because Sam is part of Charlton. They can become sites of personal meaning. So this is the statue of Dixie Dean at Everton Football Club. And it's become a place where supporters, if a relative has died, they'll leave a tribute there. So you can see those flowers underneath the statue. It says Dad, Mum. They're flowers from a funeral cortege, and they've been placed there. And that's a regular site at this statue. A place to commemorate not just dead players and fans, but also family. Finally, statues can become a site of generational learning and knowledge exchange. That's a rather posh way of saying reminiscing, really. So I'll just finish with this lovely quote. This was from the Swansea statue project, Overall Church, the Liberty Stadium at Swansea City Football Club. And this is what the organizer of the project said. There was an old guy with his 6-year-old grandson, and there were lots of similar instances where the lad saw Ivor and the lad said, "Who's that, Dad?" And then to listen to the grandfather go into some lovely, fantastic description about how fantastic Ivor was, a great player for Swansea and Cardiff and Newcastle and Wales and all of that. So these statues become a place where generations can pass on the story of both the club they're supporting or the player, but also their lives as well. Okay. Any questions at all?
Can you hear me?
Yes, hear you fine.
I think the video is not working at the moment. Thank you very much. It was an excellent talk, Chris, and gave us a real insight into how statues are becoming something beyond sport and something beyond art. You said a lot of them had been produced recently.
Yeah. Can
you identify reasons why it should have happened in this day and age rather than before?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, there's multiple different reasons. Funding. Football clubs come richer after the Premier League starts. Football clubs kick-started a lot of this. So there's increased finances at the top level, but there's also increased awareness of public image and increased awareness of branding the club to different audiences, and statues tick those boxes, as I explained in the talk. There's also a copycat thing as well. One football club gets a statue, then another one wants to copy them if it's a local club. So all of those things play in. I think in terms of towns and cities as well, one town and city sees it, and they think, oh, well, our neighbouring town's got a statue, maybe we need one in our town centre. Also, as I said in the talk as well, the lottery funding, that's something that's come in the last sort of 25 years. It's given a bit more money for public art. The change of fashion around subjects, religious and political figures becoming less and less respected, sports people becoming an obvious choice. That's again something culturally that's happened in the last 25, 30 years. All of those things come together, I think, and that's why the timeline is as it is.
One of the, I mean, it did come to mind while you were talking, Chris. My current project is on Ellen Challoner, who was the first racehorse trainer, female racehorse trainer at Newmarket. Yeah. And the campaign there is to get a headstone on her grave, which has remained unmarked for about 80 years. So I suppose graves were in the past where some of these memorials were. I think of boxers that we had in past in some of the London cemeteries. So I suppose in some ways, some of it is replacing headstones.
I think it's additional though, because headstones are still there.
Yeah,
there are some sports statues in the UK tend to be older ones, as you said, tend to be are at grave sites. So the classic example of that is the Newcastle rowing statues in the 1870s. Rowing was probably the biggest sport in the UK, spectator sport, and rowing on the Tyne was the biggest place for it, really, along with the Thames. And there were 3 great Newcastle rowers. And when they died, they all had statues put on their graves, and like hundreds of thousands of people turning out for their funerals, literally over 100,000 people at the funeral of Harry Clasper. If you look on our website for the Newcastle rowing statues, they're on there with all the others.
Right. One question we've come in about animal statues.
Right, I've got a list here, so I'll go through them. I can see them in the chat, so I'm good with that. So someone said, do you include statues of racehorses and dogs in the project? They're athletes after all. They are indeed athletes, but I don't include them in the project. As a statistician, I like to have a project where I can get everything. Racehorses statues can often be situated on private land, as in training facilities that aren't accessible to the public. Likewise, dog statues are quite portable things. So an owner of a greyhound might have a statue of him in his back garden, and I couldn't record that or put it in on a public accessible site. That wouldn't be right. So I've limited it to athletes so I can know that I can get everything. I also think there's very different meanings around statues of racehorses and dogs. There are a few you can see. I mean, the classic dog statue, Ballyregan Bob, I think, at Brighton Greyhound Stadium. It's worth going to look at. And there's quite a few racehorses around the UK. Desert Orchid, I think Desert Orchid is a stand down.
Yeah, Kempton,
that's it.
One thing that strikes me.
I'll just go through the list of the different questions on the chat window, and then I'll take time. But Anne Massey says, excellent talk, thank you. As there is so much interactivity with sporting statues, do they need to be quite robust? What are they made of? Generally made of bronze, which is again the idea of them being deeply traditional in terms of an art form. Bronze is hard wearing, but it can be brittle, and there are statues that have been broken and had to be repaired. In the UK, we tend to have statues made of bronze, but bronze is quite expensive. If you look at sporting statues overseas, quite often made of carbon fibre or resin, or even made of cement, but that just doesn't last as long. The weather just ruins it very quickly. But yeah, bronze typically. Anonymous attendee says, what about the sculptors? I'm not sure what the question is there. I mean, if I'd had an hour and a half, I would have talked more about the sculptors. I've interviewed most of the sculptors. And if you look at some of the papers on my website, I feature some of that interview material in there, and I'm more than happy to talk about those. My website lists the sculpture of each statue for the page for each statue as well. Lorna says, on the diversity category, how wide is this? Are there statues of para-athletes, Jewish footballers, etc.? There is a statue of a para-athlete, Adi Adepikatan, who was a wheelchair basketball player. He's now a presenter on BBC TV. There's a statue of him in Woking. That's the only para-athlete I know, though Ludwig Gutmann, who founded the Paralympics effectively, there's a statue of him at Stoke Mandeville Hospital. Jewish footballers, don't know. There's quite a few statues of black footballers now, including ones from the distant past as well. Jack Leslie this year, Walter Tull, Arthur Wharton. Jewish footballers, I don't know. Catherine says, do you think there should be, what strategies should be used to increase the representation of women? Well, I think there's a number of, I think ultimately it's campaigning, and it has to be grassroots campaigning. I don't think you can impose statues on people or fans from the top down. I don't think that's a good idea. It's grassroots campaigning and fundraising. And when people see the interest, I think if the funds are raised, the statue will be built ultimately.
Can I just put in there, is one statue that you have missed is the Rachel Blackmore statue that's been erected at Cheltenham. And I would like to say, with regard to horse racing, as the women come through, I'm sure that there'll be more women represented in statues. And I know when
When was that unveiled, and is it full size?
Tim, do you know when it was unveiled? I think it's 25 foot high.
I mean, her big year was 2 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've not seen that, so we'll need to add that. And of course,
No,
if anybody knows any other statues, not busts that is, but statues that they know of, please get in touch, because we like to keep up to date. And you can find some by a Google search. Ah, yes, that's a splendid statue, isn't it? So that's yeah.
The thing with I think with the racing is that as the women jockeys come through, they are very adamant that they are jockeys, not lady jockeys. They are jockeys.
Yeah.
And as they become prominent in the sport, there'll be more representations.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
women.
historically, if you look around the world in terms of statues of female athletes in sports where women have been given a fair chance to participate, there's equal numbers of female statues to male statues. Look at tennis, it's roughly 50-50 around the world, men and women. If you look at athletics and the proportion of statues of female athletes to male athletes roughly follows the proportion of gold medals that have been available in track and field events over the years. So do
you reckon with the rise in the popularity of women team sports that'll be reflected in statuary?
Definitely.
I know that when Twickenham had their female teams represented equally with their male teams when they had their street art on the stadium, so you would expect that would happen.
I'm sure it will happen. Yeah, I'm sure it will happen. Sophie says, all the statues you've mentioned have been in a secular setting. Are there any modern sporting memorials in our national pantheons, i.e. Westminster Abbey, St. Paul's? No, not that I'm aware of anyway. Is this a mark of our more secular society? I don't think in the past there were any sporting statues within churches either. If you're saying the fact they're not in churches now is because we're a more secular society, I don't think that shows it. If you're saying that in the past they weren't in churches because sport was seen as separate from religion, and they are now, well, I don't think there's any evidence for that either. There just aren't any. There's very few in graveyards full-size statues. That's partly because full-size statues are quite expensive to make. When someone's died, paying a lot for a funeral, paying for another 10-20,000 for a full-size statue, it's very unusual. But I can't think of any within churches. No, not at all. Stephen asks, are there any statues of fencers or fencing? Not in the UK that I'm aware of. No, I've not seen any. No. Anyone else?
And Sophie says we're continuing to memorialise poets in Westminster Abbey. So
yes,
maybe there should be a campaign to get sportsmen memorialised more.
Yeah, I don't think you could put statues up inside there. They'd run out of room quite quickly in an indoor area. But yeah, it would be that would be quite unusual. Anyone else?
Yes, we've taken a lot of your time.
Yes, thank you.
It's much appreciated. A wide-ranging talk. Thank you, and you've been able to answer that questions as well. So thank you very much for your time. It's as I say, much appreciated by us all.
That's okay.
And you've opened up areas of thinking that we need, rather than just looking at statues as pieces of art. They're obviously starting to represent, or in a statistician's mind, you can create other reasons for things being. So,
I'm just can I just say one more thing? So, person who asked, what about the sculptors? I mean, so it's a very, very good point, and I wish I'd had time to talk a little bit more because I have interviewed lots of them. There's this debate about whether are these statues art or not, and I interviewed Philip Jackson, who did a couple of the statue of Alex Ferguson at Man United. And he did the champion statues at West Ham. He did the Bobby Moore at Wembley. And his comment was, well, actually, it's much harder doing a footballer than, say, the Queen, because you've got to do the legs of the footballer. And his approach to doing it wasn't just to copy a photo. He took multiple images of the person, but then he used his imagination to come up with the design. And I think you'd struggle to say that wasn't art in some sense. I can see where the argument regarding it being copyism comes from in some cases. In terms of
across sporting art, we have this debate anyhow, because a lot of the early horse racing pictures, that we still have the debate whether it's true art or folk art. So I think that's when it comes to portraying sports events and personalities, that's always been an issue, hasn't it, Tim?
Yeah.
I think on the argument regarding as well, in terms of about the sculptors and looking at it from the other direction, at least one of the most prominent sculptors doing sports statues in the UK was previously a prop artist on Thomas the Tank Engine, and he does fantastic sports statues. Would he say he was an artist? I think he would say he was an artist. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
His background isn't a traditional fine art. So
thank you very much, Chris.
No problem at all.
Thank you. Thank you.
What the next lecture, as we said right at the beginning, will be on the 23rd of March at 2 o'clock. It will be the start of our third year of these lectures. I will be talking about the importance of early racehorse portraiture and its importance to the development of sporting art at the time. I'd also like to thank Sally for organising this series. Most of the work behind the scenes is done by Sally, both technically and in developing the programme for us. And as you can see, I couldn't resist her bullying. So thank you, Chris, for your talk this afternoon and for answering the questions. We have recorded the talk. It will be on our website within the week. And thank you everybody for supporting these lectures. It's much appreciated. And we look forward to seeing you in March. Thank you. And thank you again.
Thank you, Chris.
No problem. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.